But what I want you all to understand is that everything is vertical. Always go vertical. Always go vertical. Never go horizontal. Never in anything. Never go horizontal in a race-based society. And see now, look, the difference down here is that back during the old days, doing social integration, that's horizontal. We kept going back and forth from the back of the bus to the front of the bus, from the black water fountain to the white water fountain, and moving from the black ghetto to the suburbs. Those are horizontal moves. It didn't elevate you and make you a better or more powerful person because you moved to the suburbs. And see, only a few blacks trickle up on the old horizontal system. So you start at the bottom over there and go straight up, go to the top. Why don't you go to the top? Because that's where all the wealth and power is located. The wealth and power is at the top, not at the top of the T. When you get to the top, then you go horizontal. That's like when you build a business, you build your business straight up. When you get to the top and you got your own neighborhood built well with black businesses in it, you got this, and this area's got a lot of prosperous businesses, then you spread out and go get somebody else's neighborhood. When you get to the top, you go take other people's neighborhoods away from them. But don't do that until you capture and control your own. Because if you don't have a community, you cannot have a successful business. Without a community, you don't have one thing that's very important. You don't have a market. No community, no market. You go into business, you're going to go out of business within about a 2-year time period. Nobody's going to drive all over Chicago trying to find your damn store. But if you put all your stores in one place and all your business, where I can go park my car, and I can get out and park my car, I can walk and find a barbershop, a cleaners, a movie theater, a drugstore, a grocery store, a restaurant, a hotel, then you got businesses.
In recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on the Biden-Harris border policies and how they have undermined the safety and security of America. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. President Joe Biden, his appointed border czar, Vice President Kamala Harris, and Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas have sparked the worst border crisis in American history. Looking back over the nearly 4 years, Americans have witnessed a national security, public safety, and humanitarian disaster at our borders. And every day, we continue to feel its devastating consequences. The flood of inadmissible aliens across our sovereign border has been unprecedented. Since Biden-Harris' first full month in office, Customs and Border Protection has recorded more than 10.3 million encounters of inadmissible aliens nationwide, compared to 3.1 million between fiscal years 2017 and 2020. In addition, there have been more than 2 million known gotaways on their watch, illegal aliens who are at large in our communities, whose intentions and backgrounds are completely unknown. Encounters at our ports of entry have exploded from roughly 1 million between fiscal 2017 and 2020 to more than 3 million since the start of fiscal year 2021. That's largely because the Biden-Harris administration has devised a host of unlawful mass parole programs that encourage otherwise inadmissible aliens to cross at our land, sea, and airports instead of between them.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members, thank you for this opportunity. The only true consequence we have to slow down and discourage people from coming into the United States illegally is sending them back to their country of origin. Throughout the first 3+ years of this administration, I saw a steady decrease in the countries we could send people back to. For the first time in my 25 years, and under 5 different administrations, whether through neglect or on purpose, I saw a large-scale lapse in our ability to return people to their country of origin. The inability to send people home meant that most people being arrested for illegal entry would either have to be detained or released. The current administration, however, from day one, made a point of decreasing the amount of detention space available nationwide. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's funding for detention has steadily been cut and private detention eliminated. The fact that so many illegal aliens are being released into the United States spread worldwide very quickly. As this happened, the numbers the Border Patrol encountered illegally crossing the border increased exponentially. The impact to me and my agents were significant. Sectors were ordered to take in and process all the illegal aliens encountered on the border. The Border Patrol saw groups of hundreds and thousands coming into the United States and turning themselves in. These numbers pulled 80, 90, sometimes 100% of the agents on duty away from the border. Border Patrol zones across Texas, Arizona, and California had no agent presence for weeks and months at a time. Those who did not want to be caught could simply walk in. We have no idea who and what entered our country over this time. Throughout 2022 and 23, I sent agents to Texas and Arizona to count gotaways. Those sectors could not even put enough agents in the field to see what they'd missed. Simultaneously, in San Diego, we had an exponential increase in significant interest aliens. These are aliens with significant ties to terrorism. Prior to this administration, the San Diego sector averaged 10 to 15 SIA arrests per year. Once word was out the border was far easier to cross, San Diego went to over 100 SIAs in 2022, well over that in 2023, and even more than that registered this year. These are only the ones we caught. At the time, I was told I could not release any information on this increase in SIAs or mention any of the arrests. The administration was trying to convince the public there was no threat at the border. Fentanyl is another issue. The San Diego area sees between 80 and 90% of the methamphetamine and fentanyl seizures annually for our entire country. With little enforcement at the border, these drugs were coming through en masse. During my last year in San Diego, the price for a single pill of fentanyl, for example, went from $10 to 25 cents. To make matters worse, during 2022 and 23, I had to shut down San Diego traffic checkpoints, which are critical for drug interdiction, because the resources had been diverted to the process and release mission. The large numbers also had and still have a negative impact on the San Diego community. I had to release illegal aliens by the hundreds each day into communities who could not support them. To quiet the problem, 2 flights a week were provided from San Diego to Texas. These flights simply brought aliens that would have been released in San Diego over to Texas. Each flight cost approximately $150,000. This was the administration's way to try and quiet the border-wide crisis. Once these flights were stopped and the releases continued, California saw the true economic impact. I received calls from the governor's office, local mayors, and hospital administrators asking me if we could keep injured aliens in custody so the federal government would pay the medical bills. Through pressure from the administration, my headquarters became more interested in the fiction that being portrayed in the media and not at all concerned with reality. Each time we asked for help in dealing with a new issue, it fell on deaf ears. At times in San Diego, we had 2,000 or more aliens sitting in between the fences asking to turn themselves in. I was told to move them out of sight of the media. Meanwhile, Border Patrol agents are continually forgotten and neglected by the media and this administration. These agents deal with death, women and children that have been raped, abused, trafficked, bought and sold, families that have spent months in terrible conditions, sickness, and despair. If you look at the dramatic rise in the number of suicides within the Border Patrol, it is directly correlated with the migrant surge. The agents have been pushed beyond their limit, and this has greatly impacted their physical and mental health. While current numbers of aliens crossing our border are lower in comparison in recent months, there's a reason for this. After nearly 4 years, this administration finally started to ask Mexico for help in slowing down the traffic through their country. This and other actions make a difference, but why has it taken so long? All of these tactics were being used before this administration took office, but this administration stopped or greatly limited them. I'm also concerned this will not be maintained. The problems we are facing at the border have solutions. These solutions can be quite simple and cost far less than the mess currently occupying so much time and money. The return to a policy of enforcing the law and returning illegal aliens to their home countries is required. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heike. I now recognize Ms. Morin for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, ranking members, and Congressmen. I appreciate this opportunity to tell Rachel's story. It started August 6th, 2023. I was in Kentucky. We had a grandbaby that had just passed away from sudden infant death. We got the phone call, and the phone call went something like this. Hello, Mom. There's somebody here that'd like to speak to you. Okay. Hello? Hello, Mrs. Morin. This is Detective so-and-so. There's no easy way to tell you this. We found your daughter's body. I had just learned a few hours earlier that she was missing. We didn't know she was missing. She went on a trail in our town that's very public, very small, and we've walked it for over 25 years. She grew up walking this trail. An illegal immigrant that was a gotaway from El Salvador had waited for her on the trail. I was told that they grabbed her, dragged her through the woods, raped her, strangled her, murdered her. We were told that her body was blanketed in bruises. And I can tell you from looking at her when I went to the funeral home that it was probably the most graphic thing that I've ever seen. These murders are very horrendous. He then stuffed her into a drain pipe. So when the detective called and he said, "Mrs. Morin, we found your daughter's body," you know that she's dead. It was such a complete shock to our whole family. It took 10 months for them to find this a suspected illegal immigrant. They used DNA because this man had attacked a 9-year-old and her mother in Los Angeles. If they had done the border protocols that were in place but was set aside of just a simple DNA swab, they would have known that he had a Interpol warrant for murder in his home country, and that's why he was fleeing to the United States.
It's more than 5% from last year. That's because demand for those goods picked up as the country opened up.
Third straight month, prices have gone up more than expected. From the rising cost of car insurance and repairs to how much you're paying at the grocery store every week.
Do you know how much one of these costs? $2 freaking.
This was $200.
We supposed to skip the power bill this month so we can buy groceries, or the mortgage?
Before the pandemic, all of these groceries, about 30 items, cost $100 on average. Now, 5 years later, according to Nielsen IQ, all this costs 33% more, meaning you'd have to skip about 10 items like chicken, bread, milk, and bananas to make your $100 budget.
Thank you for that. Never forget. We welcome you to today's hearing. From gas to groceries, Americans pay the price of the Biden and Harris energy agenda. Today, we're going to review the past 4 years to examine how record high energy prices have impacted American families and their pursuit of the American dream. Since the beginning of this Congress, members of this subcommittee have attended numerous hearings and roundtables focused on the issues that impacted our everyday lives. Since day one, the Biden-Harris administration has waged a war on American energy, and the results have been devastating. The facts are undeniable. Inflation has surged out of control, price levels remain unacceptably high, and it all began with energy. Energy is foundational. Records have been set with historically high prices for gasoline, diesel, fertilizers, and many fossil fuel-based commodities. Supply chain shortages have rippled across the economy, affecting everything from computer chips to toilet paper. Americans are paying more for groceries, for their housing. They're paying high credit card bills, higher than when the administration took over.
I report yesterday, food prices climbed 2/10 in July. Our next guest owns 4 restaurants in Georgia and says his grocery bill is up 20% due to food inflation. Joining us now is Brian Will Restaurants Investment Group founder and CEO. Brian, it's actually crucial to have you here right now because we're hearing that Kamala Harris might go after groceries for price gouging and so on and so forth. So we're eager to try to figure out what's going on with food prices across the economy. And what's your take?
Good morning, Kelly. Yeah, and it's funny when I hear pricing is only up 2 or 3% on something, because I can tell you in the last 6 months, when we look at our cost of food in February versus our cost of food now, it's more like 20% and as high as 40% on certain items. So I'm not quite sure where they get those measurements from, but it's not what we're seeing out here in what I call the real world.
Sure. Can you be specific about where you're seeing the biggest increases, feeling the most pain?
Yeah, I'll give you a perfect example. The cost of chicken in February was $1.64 a pound. Today, that cost of chicken is $2.27 a pound. That means our cost of chicken has gone up 63 cents a pound, right? That's a 38% increase. And people say, well, 63 cents might not be that much until you think that we buy 62,000 pounds of chicken for our restaurant. So my wholesale cost on chicken for the year went from $100,000 a year to $138,000 a year. That's $38,000 that hits my bottom line.
Right.
Now look at the cost of beef and the cost of cheese and the cost of seafood, and those numbers start adding up very quickly.
How does it compare with a couple of years ago, though? Because my understanding was chicken prices skyrocketed. Then they actually came down quite a bit. They've been on a rebound lately. But in other words, we're starting from February through the summer of this year. But put that in the broader context for us. What were you spending on food a year ago, 2 years ago?
Chicken does vary a good bit, but I can tell you that my wholesale cost, when we look at in a restaurant, we look at our food cost. I can tell you 2 years ago, we tried to run a 27, 28% food cost across our entire menu. Today, we're running a 32 to 35% food cost. So you're talking about a 5% increase overall on the cost of our wholesale goods. And when you multiply that out, it costs a $5 to $6 million operation. It starts adding up very, very quickly.
Do you think there's price gouging? So when you're with the suppliers that you deal with and the prices that you have to pay, do you feel like that's what's going on?
It's a tough question. And I had this conversation with somebody last night because we buy food at what's called a cost plus. So I pay 6% over theoretically what my supplier pays for it. But I don't really know where they're coming up with their costs. So are they price gouging me? I have no idea. But I'm on this dynamic pricing, so my pricing does change. And there's not a heck of a lot I can do about it.
Right.
Can understand is Bernard Yaros. He's an assistant director at the economist Moody's Analytics. Okay, so we've talked about this in big meta terms, bad, scary thing, blah, blah, blah. But can you explain to us, if the U.S. actually defaults, even for a short period of time, where are we going to see the biggest real-world impact in the economy?
So ultimately, it's going to be the U.S. that suffers the most. But when it comes to the global impacts, there's a saying that when the U.S. sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. So in other words, when we go into a recession, we take everyone else down with us. So if we go into a recession, millions of jobs are going to be lost here. Households are going to lose confidence and they're not going to want to spend. And businesses are also going to be reluctant to hire or to invest. So if we as consumers and businesses are packing it in, that means that we're going to be importing less goods and services from the rest of the world, which would be especially bad to major global economies such as Germany or China, for example, that really rely on trade for their own growth. And there's never a good time for a global recession that results from political dysfunction in Washington, but now would be really a bad time for the global economy. Inflation is still a problem, so global central banks would not be as willing as they otherwise would be to provide much support, at least initially. And also the willingness and ability of governments around the world to provide economic support would also be limited than before. And that's just because of all the debt that governments have had to rack up over these past 3 years in their aggressive response to the coronavirus pandemic, which was really a once-in-a-lifetime economic disaster.
Yeah. Bernard, so much of the global economy relies on the dollar. How would that affect those countries that have their currency tied to ours?
So it would be problematic. I think the biggest concern for us is really, would the U.S. lose its global currency reserve status? Or will there be another currency that replaces the dollar? Mm-hmm. In the short term, the answer is no, not the euro or the Chinese yuan. But what we see is that in the near term, what would happen if the Treasury were to default on its payments is that the dollar would actually increase in value. And that's just because investors globally wouldn't know where to go except to where they always go when there's a crisis, and that's the US. And that's precisely what happened 15 years ago during the global financial crisis, when it was the US housing bubble that was at the epicenter of the crisis. But over the long term, we would see the dollar's status globally really be diminished when you have investors just starting to seriously question whether the US government is willing to meet all of its financial obligations. And central banks around the world typically hold foreign currencies and reserves to pay for imports and other purposes. And these foreign currency reserves are often held in government bonds such as treasuries. And the US dollar accounts for the lion's share of all of these foreign exchange reserves. Yeah. But a treasury default would likely prompt countries to rebalance these reserves away from treasuries and to look for other alternatives. And so there are clear long-run consequences to the dollar if we do default next month. And the risks to the dollar that I just mentioned would be even worse if we continue to have debt limit debacle after year, with more unthinkable instances of Treasury defaults, and that would really open the door for some ambitious country to really step in and try to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency 20 or 50 years from now.
The potential for widespread civil unrest grows. There are currently over 10 million unauthorized immigrants living in the U.S. at the moment. It has also been reported that there are other foreign influences circling the presidential election. Both these factors alone are some very real reasons for concern. Regardless of the outcome, political tensions are reaching critical levels. Many fear that protests, riots, and factional violence could erupt across the country. This unrest may not be confined to urban centers. It could spill into suburban neighborhoods, putting homes and families at risk. One of the most important steps you can take to protect your loved ones is to avoid areas likely to attract chaos and violence. How civil unrest could unfold post-election. Disputed election results or controversial policies could trigger large-scale protests that escalate into riots or violent confrontations at flashpoints. With the deepening political divisions, the environment is ripe for demonstrations to spiral out of control. If a significant portion of the population perceives the election result has been tampered with, or if foreign influences seek to cause post-election trouble, prolonged unrest could follow.